meet my bride. Let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile. Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill, and being a genius engineer doesn't always mean that you're also a great businessman. Many fortunes have been made and then lost by brilliant minds that could not keep a business afloat. And we've already looked at one such engineer on this channel, David Buick. Today we'll be exploring the automotive career of a man who is counted as one of America's greatest inventors. He, like Nikola Tesla, was unfortunately too far ahead of his time, and his inventions rarely made him much money. We're talking about Walter Christie. John Walter Christie was a native of New Milford, New Jersey in 1865. Like most folks born to be engineers, young Walter was a tinkerer from a young age. You know, taking apart things like watches, sewing machines, and the like to see how they worked, yet possessing the uncanny ability to put them back together, and even come up with ideas on how to make them work better. When it comes to his engineering education, he went two routes at once. He apprenticeshiped at the Delamater Iron Works, while at the same time took classes in engineering at the Cooper Union College in New York City. By the age of 20, he was not only a skilled, intuitive engineer, but had his degree as well. And so he began his engineering career in the maritime industry. Both navies and merchant marine fleets were equipped with steam engines by the middle of the 1880s, and Christie excelled at engine design and efficiency. He worked with several steamship lines of his day as a consulting engineer, analyzing their engines and how to make them do more for less. At the same time, he took an interest in submarines and began working at the foundries in New York that were making these very experimental vessels. The U.S. Navy took notice of his talents and hired him to work on some of their pre-dreadnought ships, specifically in the design of turrets. One of the ships he worked on was the USS Maine, the ship that blew up while in Cuba and sparked the War of 1898 between the U.S. and Spain. Christie had suggested a new design for the turret ring gear, claiming that the current design was inadequate to manage the recoil and pressure created when firing 12-inch guns using cordite as the propellant. Whether that particular flaw he pointed out was the cause of the Maine blowing up is not proven, but what is known is that his new hardened turret design was superior to anything else out there, and both the U.S. and Royal Navies of England adopted his improvements. By 1900, he had money from the royalties earned from his turret design and a facility to build in. Yet he wanted to make cars and not continue with naval technologies. And not just any car. He deduced that if a car was powered and steered by the front wheels, it would be able to handle road conditions far better than if it were being pushed by the rear wheels. Now, front-wheel drive cars had been built prior to this, but these were light cars of little power, and a true front-wheel drive transaxle had not been perfected yet. So Walter Christie perfected it. This 4-cylinder, 30-horsepower beast quite literally drove the front wheels straight from the engine crank, being connected to them by slip clutches. Though the steering was a bit heavy, it was fast and, in his view, proved to handle better and cause less wear on the tires. Yet he wanted to prove his concept, shall we say, under fire. So it was time to go to the races. He built a second car and took it out for some local speed trials. He and Barney Oldfield had a bit of competition in these trials, and though Barney was the victor by the stopwatch, Christie's car received some accolades, particularly due to its lightness. The car had no real transmission and drive chain, which saved a lot of weight. Race cars at the time were often over 2,000 pounds, but his was a mere 1,600. But weight distribution was an issue, as most of the weight was at the front, which did, as mentioned earlier, make it difficult to steer. Undaunted by this, Walter Christie entered his car into the 1905 Vanderbilt Cup race. Unfortunately, he collided with Vincenzo Lancia, who was driving a Fiat at the time. Lancia was furious, of course, but noticed the rather unique way that Christie's front suspension worked. And for some reason, a similar suspension showed up on the early Lancia cars. Meanwhile, Christie built another car, a huge one. Front-wheel drive, of course, but with a monstrous four-cylinder engine of some 20 liters, and entered this car in the 1907 French Grand Prix, making Christie not only the first American to race in the Grand Prix, but his car to have the biggest engine of any car in the Grand Prix before or since. However, he had engine trouble and was not able to complete the race. And though his car certainly looked striking, they did not sell well and his investors backed out. Christie was broke and needed to generate income, so he came up with the idea of an iron horse for firehouses. Back around 1907, there weren't very many fire trucks. The pumping engines used by fire brigades were horse-drawn and themselves very expensive. So Walter made a two-wheel truck that could be hitched to a fire engine just like a horse would. These were successful, and for the next 10 years he sold hundreds of them to fire departments across the world. By World War I, the need for these fire truck engines waned, and Christie was again broke. But he was able to find work with various militaries as an engineer. Indeed, his suspension designs were the basis of many U.S., Russian, German, and British tank suspensions throughout to the Second World War. Unfortunately, he did not profit from these personally, and by the end of his life in 1944, he was penniless. As cliché as it may be to say, Walter Christie was ahead of his time. It would be another 40 years before cars would be almost universally made with the engine, transmission, and drive axles all in the front in one unit. And though Christie did not profit much from his innovations, the rest of the world certainly has. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.